This video is sponsored by Forged, a brand new Kickstarter project by Broken Anvil Miniatures, but more on that later. In a previous video, I talked about Army Painter Speedpaints, how Army Painter hired me and 4 other YouTubers to help improve the paints, help them come up with new colors for the range, as well as how they are creating a new formula to help reduce reactivation. And while that's all fine and good for the average painter, one of my favorite things about Army Painter Speedpaints is the reactivation. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I use the current formula of Army Painter Speedpaints to work with reactivation rather than against it, why I think reactivation is a feature, not a bug, and just in general what my process looks like for using Speedpaints to paint a model. So let's start fresh. Here's a figure from Broken Anvil's new Kickstarter. I have primed her in white, and I will show you how I went about painting her using reactivation to my advantage. I started out by putting a few colors of speed paint onto my palette. I find these palettes with the little divots for paint work best for these paints rather than a flat surface. It just helps the colors stay wet longer. And I also just put a little bit of pale sand on my palette that we're going to use later. Now, first things first, I'm going to lay down a base coat of one of the new magenta colors from the speed paint prototypes they sent me onto her face. And there's really nothing special about this step. We can lay it on as thick as we want. And the first way we can approach doing highlights on this figure is to do it immediately before the paint is fully cured. Here you can see I have let the paint dry on her for about 5 minutes, at which point I can go in with some unthinned pale sand straight out of the bottle and start applying some basic highlights. And you can see here, because the paint is quite dry, little to no reactivation occurs. However, because the paint is quite dry, these highlights are a little bit rough looking, and we might want more of a soft, blended look for our final model. So here's where the magic comes in. We clean off our brush and then use a paper towel to absorb most of the moisture. We are left with a damp but not wet brush. And we can then use this to go in and selectively reactivate the paint, wet blending things together in a really controlled way. This takes care of the initial rough and extreme appearance of these highlights and allows us to wet blend things however we want, leaving some areas fully dark and some areas fully light. And the nice thing about these paints is you can do this as much as you want. You could take a few hours if you want, because I think the curing time on most of these paints is 3 to 4 hours. And this itself is a pretty cool strength of these paints in my opinion. But you know what else is a really cool strength? Broken Anvil Miniatures, and specifically their new campaign Forged, which is live right now on Kickstarter.com for another 48 hours or so, depending on when this video goes up. And from what I can tell, this is Broken Anvil's Reaper Bones style campaign, where the goal is to get us the most miniatures possible at the lowest possible price. All of these figures are produced in high quality plastic at a 28mm heroic scale, and with the main pledge, the one that I'm pledging at, we're getting at least 120 miniatures for $120, including some rather large miniatures, and one of them is this amazing massive frost dragon that I painted last year. And by the time this video goes live and you're watching it, it's probably going to be even more than 120 minis for $120, as this is the sort of campaign where the more we pledge, the more minis we unlock, and the better of a deal everyone gets. So I would really encourage you to take a look if this is your sort of thing. They have multiple pledge levels available depending on your budget and which miniatures you want. If you want just the heroes, just the enemies, or even just the STLs to print at home, there are options for all of those things. In addition, they are producing 5th edition content to go along with these minis, including a sort of monster manual giving stats for everything, and a 5th edition compatible module to use all of these minis with when you get them in your home and you're using speed paints to paint them all up with really quickly. I hope to do that. So like I said, this campaign is live right now on Kickstarter, but not for long. So if, like me, you want all of these amazing miniatures at a really amazing price, make sure to check out the link in the description down below. And if you do end up pledging, make sure to leave a comment down in the description telling me which of these minis you're most excited for and which you would like to see me paint up on my channel when I get them in the mail next year or the year after. I don't know. Anyway, so the other thing we can do if we want to blend with reactivation is to just thin down our pale sand slightly with water. and use this highlight on the model directly. And the more water we add to the pale sand, the more reactivation we get. So make sure not to thin down your paint too much and just use a small amount of water at first. When we do this, you can see what happens is a more subtle reactivation. The pale sand layer absorbs some of the layer below it and creates a more gradual gradation of color. The other thing you might be wondering is, can we mix in more other speed paints at this phase to create more pigmented areas or shading? And the answer is yes. Just make sure that you are only using a damp brush and not a wet brush when applying more speed paints, and we can go back and forth as long as we want like this, using these paints as a sort of combination of oil painting and glazing. You can add whatever speed paint colors or standard acrylic colors you want on top of this, as long as you make sure to dry off your brush between steps. So if you do want to do blending, use a damp brush, or you can add a few drops of water into your paints, but no more than that. And if you stick to these rules, there's no real way to screw up here. If you do for some reason add too much water and everything gets into kind of a mess, as it sometimes does, just use a completely dry brush, not a damp brush even, to absorb what moisture you can from the model, and then just leave it for a few hours to dry before continuing. Much like we have to learn brush control as miniature painters, we also, for speed paints, have to learn water control. Making sure the right amount of dampness is present in our paints in order to blend, but not so much that it floods the model. And this is the main way I like to use speed paints. Depending on what I'm painting, I don't always use speed paints. There are situations where contrast is definitely a better alternative. Like if you want to use washes on top of your base coat, definitely do that with contrast and not speed paints. But if you do enjoy glazing and wet blending like I do, this can be a really fun medium to work in. One of the other really nice things about this medium is you don't really need to own a lot of other acrylic paints aside from speed paints. All you really need is pale sand or another off-white color of your choice for highlights, and the rest you can pretty much do with speed paints or mixing your pale sand with speed paints. However, if you do want to mix other acrylic paints into this workflow, you totally can. Just make sure they aren't too watery. Don't use airbrush paints or anything with this speed paint workflow. And speaking of other acrylic paints, I have found that golden so flat paints really complement speed paints well. Check out my link down in the description for my video on golden so flat paints. Because they have a really thick dry consistency, they tend not to reactivate things when you put them on. And in my experience, you can even thin them down a bit with water without getting any reactivation if that's what you're looking for. And that's pretty much it. That is how I like to work with speed paints. I hope this advice was helpful to you, and leave any questions or comments you have about this workflow down in the description, and I will do my best to answer as many as I can. Thank you to Broken Anvil for sponsoring this quick and to the point video, and make sure to check out their Kickstarter, link down in the description. Less than 48 hours left to pledge. Thank you as always to all of our lovely patrons for sponsoring this channel. I really, really appreciate it. And this week I would especially like to thank Yeehaw Phoebe and Michael Keck. I hope all of you have a wonderful day, a wonderful time painting with speed paints, and I will see you in the next video.